Hi, my name is Wesley, and I'm a grief counselor with Hospice of Michigan and one of the facilitators of the Men Overcoming Loss group. For those who may not know, this is a grief support group designed for men who are grieving the loss of a loved one. It's for any male adult, and we welcome you to join us if you are interested. It's the first and third Tuesdays of each month, starting at 6 o'clock, and it goes for about an hour and 15, hour and a half. Um, and we have been working through an article that I've got pulled up here. That's why I'm looking down, and I might do that a few more times as well. Normally on the first Tuesday of the month, it's kind of a general open group, and the guys talk about whatever they're bringing to the group at that time, whatever's going on in their lives, their challenges, their successes, whatever issues they might be facing and want to bring to the group to talk about and get support in and to express. The third Tuesday of the month is usually more educational, and there's typically a presentation and some time for processing and application at the end of the group. But for now, 2 full months, we've been working through this article. And just to describe it here, let me bring it up to my other screen so that I don't have to keep looking down. Just to describe it here a little bit, it is written, it's an academic article written by a person named Phil Zilla, and it was published in a pastoral psychology journal. And it's a reflection on, or I should say it's a summary and observations from how many, 4 or 5 different authors. Let's see here, how many? 1, 2, 3. Looks like 4 different authors who are all ministers, again, the Pastoral Psychology Journal, although the application is well beyond well, I guess it applies to anybody, whether you're a Christian or not, or whatever your religious background or lack thereof might be. But the authors of these books that the article author looks at, they all went through significant losses and wrote books, memoirs, all from an autobiographical perspective on their experiences. And these guys are very honest and open and expressive, and they put into words what their grief experiences are like, better probably than most could. And so the author of the article looks at all of these grieving men and identifies different challenges that they face, different coping tools that they use, just different aspects that seem to be common in their grief journeys as shared in their books. So we've been working through it, talking a lot about different aspects of grief, and the guys in the group have done a wonderful job applying it to them and to their own lives, to their own grief journeys. And it's been sort of a tool for them to open up and to share, and maybe to put words to their experiences in ways that they haven't before. So it's been a good experience. In November, I believe we're planning to shift back into our more normal format. So to get to the article and the content of the group, I appreciate you being patient with me as I introduce the context here. The last issue that the author of the article identified that was common was something that he called embodied remembering. And so well, let me just read the first couple sentences of this section to introduce it. Much of the literature on grieving focuses on the physical aspects of grief and the manifestations of the somatic. If you don't know, somatic just means of the body, basically. So Warden, who is one of the authors, for example, reports the physical sensations commonly reported by the bereaved. I think this is actually from a different academic article. And they are experiences of hollowness or tightness, oversensitivity to noise, a sense of depersonalization, breathlessness and sighing, muscular weakness, fatigue and lack of energy, and dry mouth. And I'm sure there are others that could be added to that list, perhaps a sort of a pit in your stomach, um, headaches, tightness, um, exhaustion. I think fatigue might have been listed. Yeah, it was. Um, but there are a number of others that I have observed that are common with grieving people, but this is a pretty good list as well. But hopefully you're getting the idea that it's basically when you lose somebody you love, grief is the natural response. And grief incorporates a whole bunch of feelings, of course, but it's also something that you do feel in your body. And so it's something that the authors of the books observed in this article also experienced and felt in their bodies. Um, the article talks about how so many of these are kind of a physical placement of sadness. And here's one excerpt that was in the article from the author Henry Nouwen. He wrote, when we turned, he had lost his mother and he's here with his father in this excerpt. When we turned into the road leading to our house, I suddenly felt a deep inner sadness. Tears came to my eyes, and I did not dare to look at my father. We both understood. She would not be home. She would not open the door and embrace us. She would not ask how the day had been. She would not invite us to the table and pour tea in our cups. I felt an anxious tension when my father drove into the garage and we walked up to the door. Upon entering the house, it was suddenly clear to us it had become an empty house. He talks about a deep inner sadness and an anxious tension. So those of you who have lost loved ones and are going through grief, I'm sure that you can identify with this because I think it is basically a universal experience, certainly among men as well as others. And it can help to really put a name to this. Sometimes it's something that is experienced and not really named or expressed or identified. So it can help to say, yeah, that is something that I feel and that is connected to my grief. And once you identify it, you can give it attention. It can help to figure out, where am I feeling this grief in my body? And if you feel like you're having a bad day, instead of just having generally a bad day and a bad feeling, if you can identify and analyze what's going on in your body and in your mind, it can actually help alleviate some of that pain. A lot of times it can help your brain sort of process it so that it feels less overwhelming and mysterious. So you can say, it is in my stomach, it is in my shoulders, it is in my head, and so on. Very common and normal experience, and there's nothing wrong with you if you are going through that. After that, we shifted into this section on grief mourning strategies for men. These are things, again, the article is simply observing what these authors of these autobiographies experienced, not necessarily saying that these are the top things that you should do. Some of them actually are quite effective, others a little bit less so, but it can help to say this is something that men tend to do. And if you're watching this video, chances are you are a man or perhaps supporting a man who is grieving, and it can help to say, okay, this is something that I also do. So the first one, thinking about something else. This, of course, is a really natural and common way of trying to cope with grief. It can be very emotionally painful to think about the person who died and the fact that they have died and all the ways that your life is different now and how hard it is for you. It's very natural to want to sort of distract yourself and say, no, don't think about that or think about this other thing. And so that was something that was expressed in these books that the article looks at. Some examples here from the books. So grieving fathers accomplish cognitive blocking by deliberately thinking about practical, concrete details of their day-to-day lives. Certainly something that the men in our group have done as well. One father in a study here says, the way I get through the low spots, I just kind of like to think about something else that I'm looking forward to. It gives you a lift. That's something that varies from person to person. As we'll see in the article, that is not really necessarily effective for some people for a variety of reasons, but it's still something that you might tend to do. For others, it is helpful. I know there have been a couple guys in our group who have expressed that having something to look forward to, even if it's not something that you're thrilled or excited about exactly, but something that you know will be at least moderately enjoyable, that will help you feel better for a little while, that can help to motivate you to keep on going. And it can be a welcome distraction at times. And then the article talks about how C.S. Lewis, in his book on his grief, he finds that this strategy doesn't work. I'll just read this excerpt. It's not true that I'm always thinking of H, his wife, who died. Work and conversation make that impossible, but the times when I'm not are perhaps my worst. For then, though I have forgotten the reason, there is spread over everything a vague sense of wrongness or something amiss, like in those dreams when nothing terrible occurs, nothing that would sound remarkable if you told it at breakfast time, but the atmosphere, the taste of the whole thing is deadly. I hear a clock strike, and some quality it always had before is gone out of the sound. What's wrong with the world to make it so flat, shabby, worn out looking? Then I remember. So for him, trying to think of something else really backfires, as the article describes, and makes him feel worse. And this is a phenomenon that I have heard described by others many times, where if you try to, in any way, pretend like life is normal, what you end up feeling is that it's very wrong indeed, because it is normal, other than this enormous aspect that is missing or that is changed. And so trying to live in the world as it was ends up causing you additional pain sometimes. So I think that there's a wrong way to do it, and there are other ways to do it that might actually be helpful in some cases. A couple other examples: Wolterstorff, I mean, one of the authors examined, says, let me try again. All these things I recognize. I remember delighting in them: trees, art, house, music, pink morning sky, work well done, flowers, books. I still delight in them. I'm still grateful, but the zest has gone, the passion cooled, the striving quieted, the longing stilled. My attachment is loosened. No longer do I set my heart on them. I can do without them. They don't matter. So again, very similar to how Lewis writes that it's just not the same. It doesn't work for me. It ends up making me feel worse. Although this author, Wolterstorff, seems to take kind of a middle road and say that, I still do enjoy these things. I'm still grateful for them, and it's still important to keep them in my life, and it can help to think about them. But I have to admit, the zest is gone. It's not the same. It's not as interesting to me. It's not as important. It's a very common experience of losing somebody you love. It's just such a monumental event in your life that, especially at first, for the first certainly weeks, and definitely for many people months, and to some degree for years afterward, other things just sort of pale in comparison to how important this event is. It's early on, especially, it can just feel like, what's the point? She's gone, he's gone, this person who I love. So the author talks about how it seems to have only a minimal effect to distract yourself by thinking. Things are not the same. So anyway, that's probably something that you do or have done or will do, and it's good to identify it. Another one here, we talked about reason and reflection. And just to, I think, summarize this one, it can help. Well, here I'll read the beginning again. Cook determined that men used a second strategy to manage their grief. This involved a rational reflection on the situation that caused the death of their child, and a rather intentional focusing on the details of painful memories and failures, rather than blocking them from consciousness. Cook offers that this is unique to men's grieving, and that it has not been present in studies of female bereavement. So taking a look at your loved one's end of life, the things that led up to their death, what they went through at the end of their lives, and from a very sort of rational and logical and facts-based recalling and reflection, that can be helpful. And in fact, this brings up something I meant to mention about the previous area, and that is that um, Alan Wolfelt, who's an author and speaker, and we utilize a lot of his materials and perspectives in our program, our Grief Journeys program with Hospice of Michigan and Arbor Hospice. He says that essentially, to paraphrase, because I don't remember the exact quote, it's best to get as much grief work done as you can, as early as you can, or to feel and express your grief early on as much as you can, to allow it to flood over you when you get the chance, and not to hide from it, not to avoid it, not to put it off. I understand that a lot of times life happens, and our feelings at times need to be put on the back burner to take care of the situation at hand. But the grief is not avoided, it is postponed. And when it comes back later on, it can be an even worse experience. And of course, it's affecting you. In the meantime, it's something that you carry within you that can affect your sleep and your mood and your physical health and your relationships and your decisions. So it is best to face as much as you can as early on as you can. Although I also believe, based on working with grieving people, that like everything in life, there needs to be a sort of balance, and you really can't be there 24/7. You do need some sort of reprieve or retreat at times. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next section. I think it's the next section. It might be in 2 sections here, but it can help to have a place to go, a structure, a distracting thought or hobby, fill in the blank, a way of retreating from your grief so that you can feel a little bit better for a little while. I would say that you don't want to be stuck in your grief 24/7, because that's just too much. It's overwhelming. It's too much to handle realistically. And you can also sort of lose touch with life and no longer be engaged and drift from some of your supports. On the other hand, I'm sure that you've met somebody, or perhaps have been this person yourself. There are many people who go in the other direction, and they avoid facing their grief and experiencing their feelings as much as possible. And they just surround themselves with busyness and other people and all kinds of projects. They don't go certain places. They don't think about certain things. They keep their minds busy. A lot of times I'll call people a couple of weeks after their loved one has died, and they'll it's a very common expression for them to say, I'm doing good, I'm keeping busy, doing whatever I can to keep busy, and that's helping. And really, again, that's just postponing the grief. I wouldn't say that it's a wrong thing, it's a natural thing, but it's also not really helpful. It's not necessarily a sign that you're doing well. It's a sign that you're coping and surviving in the way perhaps that you need to at that time. But it's very important to understand that the grief is still very much there, and it's still very much inside you, even if you're ignoring it or repressing it. So getting back to the article, a lot of times the experience of your loved one dying and the events and the moments, the experiences that lead up to the death, that can be even more challenging, especially at first, than the grief, the missing them, the adapting to life without them. Just thinking about what they went through and what you went through, really being a part of that as their caregiver, or as just secondhand observing this person who you love so dearly going through the pain, the discomfort, the mental difficulties of trying to cope with what was happening to them. So it can help to not avoid those thoughts, not repress those thoughts, not telling yourself not to go there. That just doesn't work. It actually makes it harder. But to actually go there, at least in a situation where you feel somewhat safe and peaceful otherwise, and to say, okay, this is what happened, and to tell your story. That's part of the reason that we have these support groups, is that sharing these stories can be very helpful and alleviating of that pain. And I shared in the group something that I've learned since doing this is that it can feel a little bit crazy or wrong to revisit the same things over and over again, even, especially with the same people, if you've already told them the story. But even from person to person, if it's somebody who you've never shared these experiences with, it can feel like, I've already gone over this so many times. What's the use of doing it again? And this person's just going to get bored or annoyed. But I've learned that this seems to be a very normal way of human processing, especially huge events that are on some level traumatic. And so I encourage you to share your story multiple times, and including with the same people who have already heard it, if they're good enough friends or good enough listeners to be able to understand what you're doing and that you need this, to go over the details again. There were a couple of guys in our group this last time whose losses were very fresh, only weeks or in some cases days old. I think that, one gentleman, it was less than 2 weeks before the group. And um, this is something that they needed to do. And this is something that I've seen time after time, that early on, you just need to talk about what happened and about a little bit about what your life is like now. But really, there's a lot of processing that you, again, sort of put on the back burner, and your brain says, okay, I don't have time for that right now. I need to focus on the task at hand. But this is something that we're going to need to process through later, because it's a really big deal. Um, and then it catches up to you after the loss. And sometimes it inhibits your ability to even grieve and to try to adapt to life as it is now, because that's stuff in the past that you haven't worked through. Excuse me, I'm getting a phone call and I'll get back to them. Um, so anyway, it's important to process this stuff, to share it, to go over the details, to share your story. I apologize if I was rambling about that a little bit. Reason and reflection, going through it, telling the story can be very helpful. Oh, one more piece from this. I thought there was something else. Men who shared how this strategy of reflection and reason about grief helped them said that they had learned to accept the inevitability of the death by approaching it in a rational, logical manner. So this can be a way of alleviating guilt as well. It can be one strategy, and it might not get you all the way there and make guilt no longer a problem, but guilt is a very normal and common response after a loss. Again, it's just such a huge event in your life that it just doesn't feel like it could have just happened without a good reason. And it's very normal to sort of look to place blame, often on yourself, and that's what guilt looks like, or in some cases on other people, and that's what anger looks like. Often it's medical people, or perhaps family members who weren't there in the ways they should have been, or God, or sometimes on the person themselves, because it feels like you've been abandoned. These feelings, we know, are a lot of times not rational, but they're still there and they're still real. So we need to recognize them. But going through the events that led up to the death can help you see it more clearly and dispel some of that irrational guilt, or in some cases anger, just to say that this happened and then we learned that, and then we made this choice, which was based on everything we knew it was the best choice at the time, or at least there was a good reason why we made this choice and didn't go the other way. It can help to process that, and again, way of coping with guilt. Next section is about doing something else. And this is similar in a way to thinking about something else. But many men who we work with and who we know are action oriented. And this has a lot to do with going back to work or taking on projects, whether it's just building or organizing or whatever else. And so similarly to thinking about something else, it actually can help to have some kind of a job or a project or some kind of structure in your life, something to retreat to that requires you to focus on it. And in some ways, doing something else is even more potent, more powerful than thinking about something else, because you are forced to take your mind off of your grief at times. Excuse me. Sometimes if you just think about something else, your willpower might not be strong enough. Whereas getting in the situation, it's like, okay, I've really got to focus on this, or else it's not going to go very well. Things are going to fall through, and it's going to cause problems. So it's just good to be aware that having this in your life can be helpful to a degree, but if you do, it's all the more important that you also make time to grieve, that you do face your grief and your feelings and express them and identify them for what they are. Let's see if there's anything that I needed to read from this section. One father states, work was an escape. When I was at work, I could put this part out of my mind because I had to concentrate on what I was doing. So that kind of expresses what I was just sharing. All these activities were, in Cook's view, motivated by men's desire to take an active stance, a desire which had been thwarted during the illness by the helplessness that most parents reported at watching their child suffer and die. Cook being somebody who studied grieving parents. And so that's a good point as well. Sometimes it's almost like we're overcompensating for trying to take care of our loved ones as they were dying, something that there was very little that we could do about, and we felt very helpless and out of control. And so we take on a bunch of things that it's like, okay, you know, give me a checklist, give me a project, something where I can feel like I'm accomplishing and I have control once again. And again, I can see how that can be helpful to have as part of your life. But the fact is that grief is something that continues that feeling of helplessness and feeling out of control. It's sort of something that happens to us a lot of times. And there's only so much that we can do. You know, we can take an active role in it by sort of riding the waves of grief and being intentional about setting aside time to grieve and how we respond to it. But the actual things that we feel and how we feel them, and in many cases when we feel them, is out of our control. And the sooner that we recognize that and accept that, the better off we'll be. Here's something that I remember David reading, so I'll read it here as well. This is not to suggest that men should simply, going back a little bit, C.S. Lewis articulates the path of engagement in life and fresh impetus when he describes how his grief motivates him, saying, "For me, at any rate, the program is plain. I will turn to her as often as possible in gladness. I will even salute her with a laugh. The less I mourn her, the nearer I seem to her. This is not to suggest that men should simply transform their grief and endure, rather that it is a reminder that although grief can be dark and heavy and unbearable, there may come a time when the mourners become aching visionaries who catch a glimpse of God's new day." Some of those quotations from Wolderstorff as well. So this, Lewis puts very well about taking an active stance in grief and how helpful that can be. It can kind of be the best of all worlds, where you are taking an active role and you're doing something intentionally and you're exercising the little control that you do have, and yet you're also actually working through your grief. And as the author of the article expresses, Lewis wrote this as he had already done a bunch of grief work and is feeling a little more optimistic, and how he can turn to his wife as often as possible in gladness and even laugh when thinking about her, and saying, the less I mourn her, the nearer I seem to her. I would maybe rephrase that in a way that can apply to men who are grieving, and say that the further you get on your grief journey, the easier it is to feel close to your loved one in a way that is positive and makes you feel happy. Not to discount Lewis's experience. It's just that I think that that particular quote, when taken out of context, can help you, or can make you misunderstand the way that grief often works. And so there can eventually come a time where you can say, as Lewis said, after having been through so much grieving, that you are mourning your loved one less and feeling closer to them. That's the way that I would put it. Okay, a couple more sections here. This next one is on solitary expressiveness. And I'll just read a couple parts of the article. The Men and Cook study disclosed that they experienced periods of deep emotional expression and crying, but these periods of expressive grief were private and solitary experiences. Then later it says they did admit the need for an outlet for their emotion that they would take once they could find a private place where it was safe for them to do so. As I hope I've made clear already, and I'm sure we've made clear in our different videos, if you've had a chance to watch some of those, expressing your grief is really key. It's really foundational to getting through it. That is so much of the grief work that is that we often describe. It's expressing, and expressing sometimes does look like crying, or it does look like talking. It can also look like making, like writing, like sitting and processing, like going somewhere, just sort of an outward expression of what's going on the inside. I think that's the way that I would put it. And a lot of times, uh, creating something that wasn't there before, whether it's words and writing, or whether it's, painting, poetry, uh, something you've built, something that you've constructed or modeled. These are all different ways of grieving and expressing grief that sometimes, or in some of these cases, don't necessarily come to mind right away. But as Cook describes, as the author of this article describes, um, men have a tendency to feel less comfortable than others when it comes to expressing. And so they look for solitary moments to do that. And I want to say that there's nothing wrong with that. The important thing is that you do express. That's what the article describes as well. It doesn't really matter if it's around other people or not. You do it in a way that works for you and where you feel comfortable. Of course, I would say that the more comfortable we can get with it, the better off we will be. And so, if we can express our grief in some of these different ways, particularly through talking and expressing emotions around other people, we're going to be better off because we're going to have the freedom to do it more often. We're not going to have to shove it down quite as often. But you know what? For many of us, men and others, but particularly men, I think that we were taught that that's unacceptable, and that's been really reinforced throughout our lives, and especially from a young age, some of those most important formative years. So it's hard, and we need to, you don't have to get good at expressing your feelings around other people before you can express your feelings. And so take that solitary place. Maybe it's your bedroom, maybe it's just your home when you are alone. Maybe it's telling other people, I'll be right back. I just need a minute to myself, or I need to get some air. And you do find a place where you don't have to worry about what other people are thinking. There's nothing wrong with that. Go ahead and do it. The important thing is to express. Okay, finally, transforming grief. Let me see if there's anything I need to read here. Um, I don't think so. I think I'll just sort of summarize this section uh, with some things that I shared in the group about it. And that is that grief is transformative. You will be a different person when you get to this place of sort of healing, of um, maybe you would describe it as acceptance, but this place where you take a look at your grief journey and say, wow, I've come a long way, and I'm feeling okay and at peace with everything, at least most of the time now. I think that that's a way that I would describe what it's like to get to the other side of grief. Because as I shared in the group, as we talked about, uh, you don't fully make it through. It is something you carry with you for the rest of your life. So I hope that you're not under any delusion otherwise. But it gets easier and the load gets lighter as you work through your grief and as time passes. Um, and time alone doesn't heal all wounds. It's just one important ingredient. It's what you do in that time that is the most important, and that will lead you to healing. So, but you can get to a place where you feel like you're about as good as you're going to get. And after that, perhaps the progress is a lot more gradual on your grief journey. Um, and when you do get to that place, you will have changed. It's pretty much inevitable. If it's any kind of significant loss in your life, there are going to be ways that you're different, simply by necessity, because you've had to adapt to life, and also you've had to work through your grief. You've had to do a bunch of stuff that has been difficult, and you know what? As the article describes, a lot of this transformation actually is positive. There are ways that you are changing and are going to continue to change that are things that you'll look back on and say, I'm actually proud and glad that this is a part of who I am now in a way that it wasn't before. Now, this is not the same thing as saying I'm glad that my loved one died. You never have to say that. In fact, I if somebody were to say that to me, I'd probably want to talk to them about that and try and help them flesh that out in a way where at least where I can understand what they're really trying to say here. Um, you never have to be okay with the fact that your loved one died. Uh, and that's not what healthy acceptance looks like necessarily. But You can differentiate that from saying, I'm glad that I have grown in the ways that I've grown through my response to my loved one dying. Uh, I'm happy and proud about the way that this has changed me and that I've become a better version of myself. It's something that grief can do to us. And I share that carefully. I hope you're sensing that I'm being kind of careful with my words here, because I don't want it to come across like, like I'm trying to say, this is going to be so good for you, and it's really overall a good thing, and you're just going to be a better person, and trying to uh, just kind of point out the silver linings or sugarcoat it. Grief is really hard, and there's something I want to say about that in a second. But the fact is that it's also true that you do grow and learn, and often, you have the opportunity to be a better version of yourself. And so it's important to understand that, to recognize that, to celebrate that when the time comes, and to reflect on it. So I encourage you, even now, especially if your loss has been perhaps more than a few months or so ago, um, and you've still probably got a long way to go, but to look at your life and ask, are there ways that I have grown, maybe more resourceful? Maybe I've learned new skills. Maybe I've become more compassionate or more comfortable with myself and my feelings. These are some pretty common ways that we do change and grow, and that are actually positive, even besides all of the negative, difficult stuff that we're going through. And certainly as more time goes by, once you get past the first year, or certainly more years down the road, you can look back, and I'm positive that you'll be able to see some of those things if you look for them, especially if you've expressed your grief in a way that is healthy, as I've been talking about here, and as we talk about in our other videos and in the group. So again, just a couple other things I want to share, and then I'll wrap up here. Um, Again, in the group this last time, there were guys who had very recent losses, and there were also guys who had lost their loved ones a little over a year ago, or approaching a year. And it was really great to see those who are farther down on the journey talking about that to those who had just lost their loved ones, and also listening to them and allowing them to share and to process in some of the ways that they needed to, the ways that just about everybody needs to in those first weeks. One of the main topics that we talked about, besides the article, and it really went hand in hand with it, are the questions of, do you heal? Do you get to that place where you feel like you're better, and you're done with your grief? And so we picked that apart, and I already shared a little bit about that, so I won't go too far back into it, at least as my perspective is. But some of the things that the guy shared about it, one guy said it really doesn't get any better. And another guy put it in a way that I thought was really wonderful. I believe he was approaching his first year after the loss, the ending of the first year, and he was sharing about how, and no metaphor is perfect, and I would need to be clear about that, but this metaphor was pretty good. I thought it's like a chronic illness or a major injury that sticks with you for years, perhaps for your whole life. And in this case, it would be like one that sticks with you for your whole life, because your loved one is gone, and that's something that won't be changing. It's not that the pain goes away. It's not that the illness gets easier. It's not that you are no longer able to do the things that you were able to do physically before, going on with these metaphors, but you adapt. You cope, you get used to it, you find what works. And so just like somebody who goes through this, perhaps we could say a couple of years down the road, their life does typically look better, as long as their illness or their injury doesn't compound and get worse, of course, and they've got new things that they're dealing with. I guess you could say, that extends to grief as well. If you have loss after loss, that can also make it worse and worse, because you've got to work through all that stuff. But anyway, as long as everything stays the same in terms of the loss, or in terms of the illness or the injury, your life does look better a couple of years down the road, not because it's gone away, but because you've learned to live with it in ways that are effective. And a lot of times you feel happier, you feel less overwhelmed by the problem that you're facing. So I thought that was a good way of putting it. So in that way, the guy who said it doesn't get any better was absolutely right. Um, but hopefully, through participating in these groups, through gaining the tools that I hope you're gaining, you learn to adapt and you learn to cope in ways that are helpful and positive. And so in that way, it actually does get better. Your overall life and well-being does get better, even though the grief does not, even though the pain does not necessarily. You get more used to it and it feels less overwhelming. And that can sound sad and hard, but if you talk to somebody who has gone through that process, I'm positive that they would share that there are more pros than cons when it comes to doing that, undertaking that. Uh, and then something else, we talked about things that at first are too painful, and I shared the sort of saying or the phrase or the mantra that you can tell yourself about these things. I'm talking about photographs or going certain places or, excuse me, other things that bring your loved one to mind so vividly. They can be painful because it's like you have a fresh, very tender and sensitive wound. And you might not be ready for that at first. So it's okay uh, to put away perhaps some of the most important photographs, to turn them away because it just overwhelms you with grief at first. It's okay to avoid going to certain restaurants or, whatever it might be for you at first. But just tell yourself it's just because I'm just not ready yet. And then continue to check in with yourself as the months go by and ask, maybe I'll give that another try, because those things later on might be the same things that bring you the most comfort and the most positive closeness with your loved one. So if you do choose to hide those things from yourself and shelter yourself from those things, don't make it a forever thing, because those things that are the most meaningful and the most vivid, they often do come back around as being the most helpful. And also, I encourage you to just try to figure out where you're at with those things and push yourself a little bit. Just because it causes you some emotional pain doesn't mean that you're not ready for it. That can also be a tool in helping you work through your grief and express your feelings in a way that's healthy. So you've really got to feel it out for yourself, depending on what it is and what your situation is, and ask, okay, where's the line between this is hurtful and not helpful, and it's just overwhelming and it's just making me miserable. I need to take a break. I need to get some space from this thing in my life. Where's the line between that and this brings up some difficult feelings, but it helps me to express my grief. And also it does bring me a little bit of positive closeness with my loved one. It is both hurtful and helpful. If that's the case, I encourage you to sort of keep going and continue to expose yourself to that thing in your life when you're able to. And certainly when it gets to the place of, this is a treasure in my life that I don't want to let go of, well, don't let go of it. And again, bring it into your life often. Grief is about not letting go of the person who died and getting them out of your life, but finding ways to keep them a part of your life where they can be a part of your life forever. So one last thing, and that is just about hope and hopelessness. Again, just going back to the makeup of our group this last time, you had guys who were further along in the journey talking to the guys who had just lost their loved ones very recently about the progress they've made, or in some cases, the progress they felt they have not made yet. And in some cases, their hopelessness and feeling like they're not going to really move down the road significantly of their grief. It's all over the spectrum, and that's reality, and that's okay. And I want to share with those of you who may have lost your loved one very recently, it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. And I laugh just because that's an uncomfortable fact. It's something that I wish I didn't have to share with you. Your grief is going to continue to sink in more deeply, more clearly. You're going to become more aware of it. Your denial is going to fade. And it's going to be hard. But on the other side of that, there is great opportunity for healing and growth. Your life can be good again, even though it's going to be good in different ways. You'll never go back to the way that it was. You'll never go back to the way that you were. but you can still have joy and peace and good days in your life. You can even have more good days than bad days. It's going to look different. There's going to be a lot of learning and adapting, and in many cases, rebuilding that goes on. So it's hard. Um, and I wish that you didn't have to go through it. But now that your loved one has died, the alternative is giving up and succumbing to despair. And of course, your life isn't going to be looking any better down that road than it is going down the road of saying, okay, this is hard and I'm going to feel this pain because it's going to be with me one way or the other, and work through it and get to the other side. I often hear people say, my coworkers, and I share this as well sometimes, that the only way out is through. There's no way around it. Um, so I think that this group is particularly helpful for people compared to some other resources out there, unfortunately. And there are many other good ones as well. But we're honest about the fact that it is really difficult and hard, and we need to sort of sit with that pain. We don't sugarcoat it. And I think that everybody who is a part of our group is on the same page about that. And so it can sound kind of down and depressing, but really it's by doing that and by looking at it in that clear way that we're able to actually have some progress and have guys like some of the guys in this group who had been doing this for a while and have been doing a good job and kept at it. They've been able to reflect on their own progress, which is a really cool thing, of course, to see as a facilitator. You might be able to tell I'm tearing up a little bit because it's just it's a wonderful thing. It's such an honor to be a part of that. And it's also very hard to witness sometimes, but overall, it's just like it's overall a good thing for them. It's overall a good thing for me, and I'm sure for the other facilitators in this group. So anyway, this is a little bit of a longer one, and I hope that this has been helpful to you on some level. Thank you for watching. I hope that you're able to join us in the future. Again, first and third Tuesdays of the month at 6 p.m. And you can get a hold of me. I would say the best way to learn about the group and to register is to go to our website, which is hom.org. That's Hospice of Michigan, hom.org. And up at the top, you can click Grief Support. And from there, it's very easy to navigate to the page about all of our groups, including Men Overcoming Loss. If I'm not mistaken, that's towards the top of the page. And again, from there, you can register, you can get in touch with me or one of the other facilitators. So thank you for viewing this. I encourage you to watch it again if you feel like that would be helpful. Certainly share it, get the word out about the group and these videos, and hopefully help others. Hopefully it's helpful to you. Okay, thank you and take care.